everybody, Joe Malarkey here again. Let's talk about the labeling side of DLP. Now, we all hear the labeling a lot in Office 365. You hear about sensitivity labels. You hear about these AIP labels. You hear about another service called the RMS service. All these acronyms and services, and what are they? How do they work together? Are they the same thing, in fact? And the answer kind of is, yeah, sort of. They're the same thing. They're kind of an iteration from the beginning to the end. So let's talk about these and their history, where they came from, and then maybe where they're going. So right now we have sensitivity labels. And these sensitivity labels came from the AIP labels, which was Azure Information Protection. Azure Information Protection spawned out of an earlier service that's still around called the RMS service, or Rights Management Service. So the first service that came out was RMS. And it came out a while ago in the before time, back in 2003. In on-premise servers, Microsoft came out with this service you could install called the Rights Management Service, or RMS service. It's also called the Information Rights Management Service, IRM. You see IRM pop up in PowerShell here and there, and it's the actually a way to configure part of the RMS service. So, what was RMS in the beginning? Well, RMS came out of a need to supplement rights that you could put on the file system, NTFS rights. So NTFS rights, they're file system rights. You can give someone the permission to read a file or write a file. That's pretty much it. Delete, create new. There's not much else. That's it, right? So Microsoft wanted to come up with a way to restrict other things that people do with files, like when you have the file open, can you copy from it, paste somewhere else? Can you print a file? For emails, can you forward an email? So you can't do this with file system permissions. So they came up with another way to do it, this RMS method. So how does it work, and how did it work? Well, the first thing you got to do when you're doing that kind of thing is the only way to make it work right is you have to encrypt the file, and you got to keep the keys somewhere else. And people actually have to go to that somewhere else place, it's the RMS service, and they have to authenticate against it to get these keys to open up the files. So that's the first thing you have to do. So any RMS file that's protected with RMS, it's encrypted. Okay. Then you have to have all of the client-side stuff, the operating system, the programs like Microsoft Office. They all have to know how to use it. When I'm in Microsoft Word, I click on the Open button. I try and open up a file that's been RMS encrypted. Well, Word has to know how to open that thing up. Word actually has to know that, well, this is an encrypted file. I'm going to have to go to this RMS service, authenticate the user, retrieve the key, see what rights the user is allowed to do, like is the user allowed to print, open the file, and not allow the user to even issue those commands that they're not allowed to do. So the print command would become grayed out. Copy would be grayed out. In Outlook, forwarding can be grayed out. So applications have to know how to work with these. So that's where RMS came from, and it worked fairly well. When it came to other people and other companies using your files, that became a little more difficult because then they had to have RMS service. You had to kind of have them talking to each other. That was a little hard to set up. But fast forward into the cloud, Office 365. Microsoft took that technology, well, they threw it up in Office 365, where it still is. And it worked the same way. If you tried to open up a file that was RMS encrypted, well, you would have to authenticate against the RMS server, this time in the cloud, the Azure RMS service. And then you would get the decryption key plus your rights to that file. Office programs, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, they all still know how to work with that service. So it pretty much worked the same way, only better. It was already set up for you. The federation between different companies in Azure AD, that worked by default, still works by default. So all that cool stuff behind the scenes that was real troublesome in on-premise RMS kind of works in the cloud a lot easier. You don't have to get involved with it. So that's what RMS is, and it still is that. RMS gives rights to files. It encrypts the files and it keeps rights for who can do what. For the most part, though, it really just works well with Office programs and Office file types. They did improve it to work with other file types, but really just for encryption. You can't put extra rights on the other file types like PDFs. You can't have, copy and paste aren't available, prints not available. You can't do that. It's just, is it encrypted? Can you get to the decryption key to open it up in the first place? But it does work with those, just not as well as it does with the Office files. So RMS is still around, and it's still called RMS. So, but then Microsoft came up with some extra functionalities that they would like to do to these RMS files. They came up with the idea of, well, let's label files. And then have a label that can go with the file, and maybe we can do some other stuff. We want to recall files, possibly, revoke permission on them, and they added a bunch of functionality like that onto it. So they renamed the service pretty much, or they created another service that worked on top of RMS, and that was called the Azure Information Protection Service, or AIP. And that was around for a while. It's still around. You can actually still get to the portal if you go to the Azure. The portal.azure.com, and you search for AIP. You can still get to it, but it's read only. You can't really do anything there. They're going to whack that whole thing pretty soon. So then they wanted to add more functionality onto these labeling. So they came up with a nice way to put watermarks onto labels. And so, you open up a Word file, you can have a watermark on it, or Excel or PowerPoint, still just those. Even Outlook, you can have a little bit of watermark header and footer. You can't have a middle of the page one yet. So they did that, and they renamed the whole thing again, or they put a new name on this new service that kind of umbrellas the other ones, and that is sensitivity labels. So sensitivity labels now is the big thing. If you open up Word or Excel, you look over to the right-hand side of the standard ribbon, you'll see a sensitivity button. If you click on it, you probably don't see anything because your company hasn't created any labels yet. Or maybe you have, so you see some labels there. So that's where things have progressed. They started out with this RMS, and RMS was just giving rights to files, print, copy, paste, whatever. Then that got ported into the cloud, and they came up with some new things, and they changed its name, sort of, added something else called AIP. And AIP is where we get the real idea of this labels. Behind the scenes, the labels are actually what are called rights management, or RMS templates. And the template just says, well, this group is allowed to print. This group is not. So RMS still holds that, but in the AIP, the label set all that stuff, and you could make the labels colors, some other things are added into it. And now we have sensitivity labels, which are pretty much the same thing. Not really, though. They had to actually get the labels out of AIP, if you had them, and port them into sensitivity labels in order to make them work, if you wanted to keep your old labels. So it actually is a different service. They couldn't just apparently add on to the AIP service, so they made this new sensitivity label. Now we have a bunch of other cool things. Sensitivity labels can now be used as a condition for DLP policies in a lot of scenarios. So sensitivity labels are the new thing. And the labels, again, on the back end, you still have the RMS server. Now the interesting thing about labels is you don't have to have encryption. You don't need to use the RMS service. You can just have a label that doesn't have any encryption at all, in which case it does not use the RMS service, which technically makes it a much different thing. And if you don't have the RMS service encrypting it, people can get rid of that label. It's just a label that's on the metadata for a file. And if I get a file from you, well, I can get into that file and get rid of that label, no problem. The only way to prevent somebody from doing that is to actually encrypt the file, and the only way to do that is to use the RMS service on the back end. So when you go and make a label, you go into the Compliance Center, go to the Information Protection solution, it's on the left, and you see labels and label policies. When you go into labels, you create a label. As you click through the different screens, you'll get to the point where you have an option to click on encryption. If you don't do that, then it's not using RMS. If you do that, then you're about to set RMS rights. And that label, when it gets applied to a file or an email, will communicate with the RMS service, encrypt that file or that email, and place rights on it. So that's where it all came from. So we're using sensitivity labels now. AIP, that word is still floating around there. We have an AIP unified client that you can install into Office. You can also install an AIP viewer onto mobile devices. So the word AIP is still there. It's kind of a short name. I guess they figured, well, let's just keep that. But the AIP service is going away. And that the word AIP probably is going to disappear as well. That AIP Unified Labeling Client, Microsoft just announced that they're not going with that anymore. They're not going to improve it anymore. They're going to build this client stuff right into Office and into the operating system on Windows, which is good. And I don't like having to add an extra client on there to get extra functionality. We'll talk about this in another video, but Office comes with an AIP client built right in, but it's missing a bunch of features. So if you want those cool features, you got to add this extra add-in to Windows to give it the extra features. So we'll talk about that when we get a little bit further into sensitivity labels. But that's it for now. A brief history of RMS, AIP, and sensitivity labels. We'll see you next time.